Hello.
We'll get started. Thanks for joining us, everyone who's out there. I suspect people will progressively join in. Thanks for coming to the first session in our series of talks that we're running as part of the Better Futures Australia, this sector being the built environment. And we're starting off today with some amazing speakers from around the world and around Australia. Trying to paint a picture of what better futures might mean. A little bit of an introduction, and then I'll start to introduce our first speakers. I think it's always important to understand who we are. I'm an architect, urban designer, environmental city maker. I teach, I'm a member of the Climate Reality Project, and I'm interested in all this work in transformational change. I'm speaking to you all from the land of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation. And we're very pleased to be able to be in this country and to experience the generosity and stewardship of those people. I think it's important that we do more, of course, than simply acknowledge our Indigenous brothers and sisters, but engage with them and listen to them and learn from them and work with them, because I think if we are to have a way through these new worlds that are being born all around us, it is with the cooperation and partnership of our Indigenous peoples. And of course, they are new worlds. You know, Einstein said you can't use an old map to explore a new world. Similarly, I don't think we can tell the same stories when our worlds are changing. So this series of discussions is about those new stories for a new world, or worlds, plural. But some that are almost science fictional in unbelievability. The ultimate aim of all of these talks across all the different sectors of Better Futures is to shape an agenda that Australia will take to the COP26 talks in Edinburgh next year. But what we're finding is that we need to express these things beyond targets or policy points or disconnected statistics. Those things tend not to really move politicians, or more importantly, move people. I think the question we're asking is, how do we generate a kind of belief, a kind of consensus in what we need to do? And it does center on belief. You know, one of my favorite science fiction characters, 𝗕𝗲𝘁𝗁𝗲, said, I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. We're at a stage in our history where we can all say that. We have all seen things that a few years ago we wouldn't have believed. You know, rain bombs, an entire continent on fire, the Arctic on fire, last week the Antarctic melting, you know, a plague of locusts of biblical proportion, and a pandemic, economic collapse, social inequity, civil unrest. Now this very interesting prospect of stitching together all these things in the face of a climate crisis that has not gone away, but is only progressively getting worse every month that goes by. But these things are not episodic or isolated. The climate crisis is the inequity crisis. It is the extinction crisis. It is the pandemic. It's the economic collapse, in that they're effectively caused by the same things. The fundamental configuration of how we are in the world together. Now, if you think these things are impossible to solve, then consider this, right? Had you told me 9 months ago the airline industry would completely collapse and contract in a matter of weeks, the cruise industry would disappear, the oil industry would contract to almost nothing to the point of economic collapse. If you told me that colonial statues would be knocked down, or slavers' statues would be tossed into the waters off of Bristol, I would have said that you were you were being fanciful, right? But look at these things that have happened. Countries immediately instituting, abandoning austerity for social welfare. Spain instituting universal basic income. This transformational change has been pointed out in the last months that not only is it necessary, but these crises, the polycrisis, new word, has shown these transformation change to be possible. So in a sense, the talks in this little mini series we have here is about where we want to go. That's what today's talk is about. The second is how we need to change our practices to get there. And the third is a little bit more imaginative. Is what else do we want in our sustainable futures? We'll be asking all of you to solicit ideas for that. But firstly, to talk about how we are in the world together and how understanding our past might allow us to imagine the future. I would like to introduce Alison Page. Alison is a descendant of the 𝗕𝗲𝘁𝗶𝗶𝗴𝗴 people of the Yuin Nation. She is a very highly regarded, highly creative practitioner working across a number of disciplines at the kind of leading, if not bleeding edge of contemporary design and storytelling. And in the bio it said Aboriginal this and Australian that. I'd like to think we're approaching a point where those two words are conflated. Alison's bio and all her works are, again, too lengthy me to go in here, but I urge you to look at her LinkedIn bio, because there is a multitude of works that do these two things of fusing contemporary ideas about how we make our stories with the indigeneity and the deep, deep storytelling of Australia. And finally, if you have not yet seen it, the film she made as part of the First Encounters exhibition installation at the National Museum of Australia, in my mind, is a masterpiece of coexistence and shared understanding. Alison.
Thanks, Tom. I thought you'd also mentioned that I have a really fantastic 𝗕𝗲𝘁𝗁𝗁 onesie, which I know you've seen. I'll just share screen. While I do that, I'll just acknowledge the land of the 𝗕𝗵𝗴𝗶𝗶𝗴𝗴 people, where I'm calling in from, 𝗕𝗲𝘁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗲𝗏 Harbour, where I've been based for most of my career, actually, probably 20 years now. I've lived up here, but I'm from the 𝗕𝗲𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁 people from South Sydney, from 𝗕𝗲𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁. So in my early practice at Merrimer Design in the Government Architect's Office, you know, we sort of knew that, we knew from our own cultural teachings that, you know, Australia is a cultural landscape, and that it is embedded with stories that have layered with stories that are added to over thousands of years. In my practice now, I suppose over the years, I've just got more and more obsessed with the storytelling part of it. And so in a way, the medium to which that's told, whether it's through sculpture or film or architecture or urban design, it's all place-based. And I think it's just about sort of allowing the place to kind of speak to that. Oh, I'm going to start my timer because I'm a terrible waffler. Yeah, I think, you know, what's really interesting about the stories, and it's really what I want to talk to you today about, is songlines, and how, you know, Aboriginal people lived here for 65,000 years, right? They lived successfully, they lived sustainably, and they lived through major climactic changes without the written word. So how does a culture do that? And the answer lies in songlines and through their traditional knowledge. I'll go back to that quote later, but it's through the, you know, it's funny because, you know, Aboriginal people were always sort of seen as a savage people, you know, especially by Captain Cook, but you know, Cook's men and Banks particularly. But I love this quote from Captain Cook as he sails off the coast of 𝗕𝗲𝘁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁 after he's been here, and he's had, you know, because in Cooktown, there was this major environmental protest about Cook catching 12 female turtles during breeding season. And, you know, the 𝗕𝗂𝘁𝗴𝗶 people just cracked it. And so he sort of got it that, you know, that they live in this peace and tranquility, that the land and sea provides them everything they would ever need. And, you know, it goes on and on, actually. He says they don't need houses, they don't need material items and clothes and things like that. So I kind of like to give Cook props for, you know, getting us, you know, because this is a man from Georgian England when, you know, a society was defined by its architecture and its agriculture. And interestingly, this country had very sophisticated environmental architecture and extremely sophisticated sustainable agriculture. They just couldn't see it. And they would never have been able to see it. It would have been an impossible meeting of the minds. And so in a way, my work now, I sort of feel like this responsibility that I'm sort of standing on the beaches with Captain Cook right now. And we have this opportunity to have a meeting of the minds and to have a dialogue about how we might kind of bring traditional knowledge together with Western science, because don't forget, you know, Cook was on a scientific voyage. So a lot of my work now is about traditional knowledge. And, you know, I didn't ever really know what songlines were, even though, you know, I was brought up Aboriginal and whatever, but it's not like you sat down and said, well, the songlines are this. Songlines was a term that was coined by Bruce Chatwin, and, you know, in a way he sort of got it right. He's American and he's an anthropologist, and he came over for a little while and spent some time in remote Australia. And he got the part about, you know, storytelling and songs being a mnemonic, if you like, for wayfinding, you know, a way to get from A to B. But it was only one part of it, because this country has a network, an invisible network of lines that are crisscrossing. And what those lines are is threads of knowledge, strings of knowledge. I went down to Urunga and kind of built a model of it just to kind of get a sense of how it actually works, because everything is interconnected. And so when you pull this thread over here, this thread moves over there. And so, and it all relates to knowledge of the land and knowledge of the environment and knowledge of the climate. And so, and that's how you can kind of map those changes. So for instance, you know, when this constellation is on the horizon, that will tell you when these animals are good to eat, where to find water in drought, you know, when this plant is in flower. And so all of these systems of, you know, nature, you know, instead of being sort of separated into taxonomic sort of classifications of science, they were very much all threaded together into these webs of knowledge. But what it was, more interestingly, and I think this is the really interesting thing for architects and designers and anyone who is working in the built environment. I mean, I sort of like to use the term cultural landscape now because that's what it is that this fantastic system of memory was, so you would, the average person had to know like 400 plants, when they flowered, what time they flowered, which parts were poison, which parts were potion. You know, the sheer amount of environmental and cultural data that one person had to hold in their heads at any given time was so great that they had to have a way of remembering it. And so they would embed that knowledge into geographic places and also into artifacts and to the things they designed and the things they built. So that as you walked through country over time, you would remember, you would sing that knowledge back to you. And so, so say for instance, you go on a morning walk, you could start to build your own songline. If you wanted to learn, say, the periodic table, or you wanted to learn the countries of Africa, you could just start to use some of the places, the trees, all the little details. You could start attaching knowledge to those things. And then the next day you could add another layer of knowledge. And then the next day you could add another layer of knowledge. And each time you would be uploading and downloading more and more data. So that's essentially how songlines work. I mean, a lot of other cultures have these sort of memory systems. The Turkish have memory, the Turks have memory palaces and things like that. So, but this is how Aboriginal people learnt how to, we're able to recall this vast amounts of data. And we know that they manage the land in a way that, you know, was completely sustainable. I mean, I love this story about, and they had a compulsion to care for country. So even with fire stick farming, you know, in the early 1800s, there was a Tasmanian warrior named Manalagana, and he, you know, in early Tasmania, there was basically martial law declared. So anyone could just pick up a gun and just kill an Aboriginal person. It was just like a free for all, basically. And Manalagana was extremely amazing at sort of like getting his people, you know, harbouring his people and getting them around. And he's being chased by bounty hunters. But his compulsion to care for country was so great, he couldn't not run past a piece of country that needed burning, and so he would stop to backburn as he's being chased, and that's how he was caught. And so I love that story because, you know, his compulsion to care for country was so great that he held it above his own life. You know, you were sort of taught about this custodianship. And of course, if the tree has been embedded with so much knowledge over time, every single day, then why the hell would you go and chop down the tree? Because you may as well go into the library and just burn every single book in the place if you start to destroy country. And that's sort of what this kind of means. And so I think in a contemporary sense, you know, we as, you know, design professionals are really just trying to look for ways in which we can tap into those song lines that are still there and find new ways in which we can revitalise them. I love 𝗕𝗲𝘁𝗁, which is this beautiful native garden which is on top of a skyscraper down at Redfern. And, you know, Christian Hampson and Clarence Slockey, I mean, they're just doing an amazing job, because this is not just about built elements. Of course, it's about grown elements and how those things intersect. And, you know, I did literally filmed something with Christian and 𝗕𝗲𝘁𝗁 a couple of weeks ago, where we built the farm of the future on a plate using native ingredients. But there is a little bit of traditional beef there. There is some kangaroo there. Of course, there is native grains. We know with native grains that they need no pesticides, no irrigation. Their root systems release rhizomes into the soil and aerate the soils and rejuvenate the soils. And so, but also, you know, like salt bush, for instance, you can use salt bush to actually draw up all of the salt out of the soil, and then feed it to lamb and have delicious salt bush lamb. So, you know, I think for me, it's about kind of finding that intersection between, you know, Australia's really sort of happening food culture and, you know, really sustainable farming practices. That how am I going for time, Tom? Oh shit, I've got to hurry up. There's just really interesting stuff about native vegetation and how, you know, like with the rabbit-proof fence in Western Australia, it's massive, 2,000 kilometres, 2,000 miles, I think, of fencing. On one side of it's got heaps of vegetation. On the other side, it's just been cleared for agriculture. And when you look at satellite images, scientists have noticed that the clouds actually form over the side of the fence with the native vegetation. So, you know, they call them square clouds because they actually follow the kinks in the fence. That's how, you know, because you get 20% more rain on the side that has the vegetation. So farmers who are adaptable, farmers who are resilient will be looking at like native vegetation and wild harvest on their farms, that's for sure. Not to mention, you know, the world of native medicines that are out there too, and how they can improve our world. And look, you know, like this is Wilcannia Hospital, you know, like when we developed this a long time ago now with 𝗕𝗲𝗁, you know, we spoke to the community. This building was a living entity. So in the Indigenous worldview, all things are living. There is no inanimate object. So the rock has knowing. That is a really interesting, and all artifacts have knowing. So the artist or the maker is a medium by which the ancestral beings are working through the creator to embed all of the stories into the artifact, because don't forget that's part of the Songlines network and it's part of the mnemonic as well. So, you know, I think that's a really interesting concept for architects and designers to sort of get their head around too, that how can you embed stories about sustainability into the things and the places that you are creating that compel people to want to, that connect people to that place and compel them to want to care for it. So I think ultimately our challenge really is to find ways in which we can intersect Western science with traditional knowledge to make the invisible visible. And like what Tom was saying about, you know, creating new maps, you know, the physical landscape itself is the map. And so it's up to us, I think, to kind of think about how your building or your object or your space, you know, what are the mnemonics that you can embed into that place, a little bit of ritual on a day-to-day basis that compel people to want to care for country, to, you know, that paints a better future ultimately. The end. Thanks.
Thank you, Alison.
Time.
No, this perfect. We allowed a little bit of looseness. But a couple of things which I hope you will touch on later, and I'll introduce it, is this idea of Aboriginal science and Aboriginal technology, which has a completely different place and meaning within these cultures and these countries, completely different from the Western idea of what these things are, and more importantly, what they're not. You know, our ideas of science and technology tend to exclude a lot of things, tend to exclude a lot of that. So we'll come back to that now. Thank you very much. It was beautiful. It's my pleasure now to introduce Amanda Spurgeon. And I think this is a very nice segue from Alison to Amanda. Amanda's currently regenerative design lead at Mott MacDonald, one of those very interesting multidisciplinary architecture engineering firms that I find a lot of these firms are having real impact in terms of the scale of the work they do. She is, I would safely say, a kind of global expert on regenerative biophilic design and strategy. She's an architect by training and by practice, and she has been working in this space for a long time as a thought leader across regenerative technologies, zero carbon strategies, biophilic buildings, living infrastructure, and kind of the life, literally, of cities and how we build and operate them. Before she joined Mott MacDonald, she was head for many years of the International Living Future Institute, and she's the author of a really wonderful book, which I urge you all to get, Creating Biophilic Buildings, and she's delivered a couple of TEDx talks on that. Amanda, thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for that lovely introduction. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to share just a couple of slides. Hopefully this all works smoothly. Okay, assuming you can all see that. Does that look fine, Tom?
Yes, we can see that. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So You know, for the last 150 years or so, nature has always come last. It's not valued, it's seen as soft or doesn't have economic benefit other than to, you know, just sort of be used for resources. And, you know, people and economics and money have dominated. So, you know, what we've seen, and I don't know if you've had a chance to watch the latest documentary by David Attenborough on Netflix, is that, as he would say, humans have overrun the world. And, you know, his story of global decline over his lifetime and over my lifetime is actually incredibly tragic and really very sad. And so, you know, I think we're looking at the last period of time in many of our lives and seeing that really we've destroyed nature. We've destroyed the world that sort of, you know, we depend on for survival. And the time has come upon which there's, you know, really no way we can keep going in the trajectory we've been on. So, you know, the work that I do, regenerative thinking, is about how do we make a very quick kind of turn back to the indigenous thinking that, you know, Alison just so beautifully shared with us. And how do we go back to reawakening our own relationship with nature, celebrating it and using it as the key deciding factor in anything that we do. You know, it'll be tough, right? Because we've built these sort of environments that are dependent upon the economic system that we're now caught up in. You know, our engineering, architecture, design, people that make the fabric of our cities and urban environments haven't been trained to think this way. In fact, quite the opposite. You know, and that goes through to sort of all industries. And so we have this massive turnaround to make within the next decade. And the space that I work in regenerative design, is really focused on that architecture engineering community and trying to get the cities and urban spaces that we create to really think about nature-based solutions first. So what I see us needing to do, especially as more and more of us become urbanized, as more people moving into urban areas every single day, there are more people living in urban areas than there are in non-urban areas, is that, you know, there's an opportunity to think about our urban areas as wild places. You know, we've separated our relationship to nature, so we'll go at the weekends or on holidays to the wilderness, but we don't think about this connection to nature as something that happens every day in the work that we do, in the way that we live, even in an urban environment. So there's a real push, you know, amongst the industry for this rewilding of our cities. And not just adding more parks, but how do we bring that in every infrastructure, every road project, every you know, building project that we do, and make them truly wild and connected to nature. What we do know is that health of people is dependent upon the health of nature. As we focus on the health of people right now with COVID, I think we missed the point that actually that's dependent upon the health of the world and the planet that we live on. And, you know, we are intricately connected, and there is no way we should be designing or building anything in our urban environments without that connection coming to the forefront in our design decisions. So regenerative design is very much about systems thinking. How do we bring back this connection between different systems back to the way that we design our cities and buildings? And how do we connect all of these global issues that we're seeing around the, you know, destruction of nature that has caused us to get into the issues around climate and poverty and pollution and equity and health issues, and how do we see them as being all connected? You know, how do we create solutions that are all connected so that we can solve these interconnected problems versus looking at them as individual issues? I think that's one of the key issues to bring to COP actually next year in Glasgow, is the interconnection between all the issues that can often be siloized. So what does this look like in our cities? I think we're starting to see some approaches where we're recognizing that the sort of approach of building bigger walls and pumps and systems to try to overcome nature isn't working. And instead we could actually start to look at these sort of natural solutions that could essentially tie in ecological solutions into the problems that we face around the world. This was a design competition that the organization that I ran previously held for global cities to look at how would you bring nature back into our cities and rewild them. We're starting to see some of that in some city interventions with the New York City High Line, for example, and this idea to kind of bring, you know, the wildness into our cities again, and to really think about how we can re-engage in that relationship with nature. So I'll just leave you with, you know, a few of my suggested solutions: rewilding our cities, becoming stewards of the land and not owners. As you know, Indigenous communities and cultures have always, you know, not seen us as being able to own land. We're merely stewards of it. We're stewards of nature. How do we move back to that sort of economic framework where we can look at the land that we're standing on as being something we're taking care of and not there just for our use to see how much money we can make from it? How can we learn from Indigenous cultures in a legitimate way and really embed that into our structure of how we think about economics? And how can we, you know, a first step and what I've been focused on with biophilic design is how do we at first reawaken people's connection to nature so that they can understand that they are part of nature and it's not something that we're separate from. We're not separate from the land or from all other ecosystems that are here. We're intricately connected, and we can only thrive if all other species are thriving as well. So yeah, I'll close there. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. That was a perfect expansion of some of the themes that Alison has introduced. And for me, it brings us even closer to, I think, a seminal question about this idea, about the separation between us and the inanimate and animate world around us. It's not just a physical separation, it's a conceptual, philosophical separation. And as you say, it's completely linked to our systems of capital, of commerce, of governance, and that's the challenge. So we'll come back to that when we have the discussion later. I'm very pleased to be introducing Megan Sharkey, who's now the New South Wales manager of walking and cycling. And it makes me immensely pleased that we have people in those positions, that we actually have those positions. Megan is a specialist in sustainability, urban transitions, and this really beautiful thing, micro-mobility. It sort of works against everything that our systems are about: bigger, better, faster, more. The micro is possibly one of the ways in which we'll get through all of this, by thinking smaller and more specifically. She's spent the better part of the last decade or so working for businesses, communities, local national governments here and in the UK and in the US on these ideas. How do you instill the sustainable infrastructure we need to make these transitions? She's currently a research scholar at the University of Westminster and is doing a thesis on grassroots and governmental barriers to all of these ideas. And I think that one of the things we constantly find is not the question about where we want to go, but what's in the way of us getting there. And so she's working on that same sort of thing back in Australia, and the idea of cities as being healthy environments, which she's exploring through a micro-mobility of her own sort, chasing her kids around on their scooters and skateboards. Welcome, Megan.
Yes, thank you for having me, and I'll share my screen. And it's interesting. I love looking at the world and the way we move around through my kids' eyes, because they always inevitably see things completely different than I do, and it's fantastic because they always come up with just so many different aspects of things that I never considered, or I don't often think about, or that you just forget. Which leads me into something that Alison said, that You pull this thread and then this one moves. And I actually think that transport is a lot like this. It is the foundation on which society moves and interacts, whether you walk or skip or scoot or skate or ride or drive or fly. It is how you move about different places and then how you interact with those places in which you move. So if everyone can, I think you should be able to see my screen. If you don't recognize this, this is the Wakanda vision of transport, and it's what I wanted to talk about. Wakanda, for those of you who aren't into Avengers, which is another aspect my kids have introduced me to, is a fictional city in Africa that thrives on the things that I think actually transport needs to succeed in the future. The first being people first. In this photo, you'll see that people are a main part of the infrastructure. It is what activates the street space. It's what connects us to the daily element, whether you're walking or cycling. It is actually what makes cities vibrant. When people are outside, when people are engaging with their friends or with their schools or with their businesses, it activates the street space. It enables sustainability because it is at one time efficient and sufficient for our health and sustainability. And it is also the thing that we have done, for many millennia is walk. The second thing that I like about this and why it's important is this idea of efficiency versus sufficiency, and how we need to look at future transport and what we need for future transport. So this is a few things. One is the shared system, and whether this is shared bikes, shared scooters, shared vehicles, in order for us to have a sustainable transport or carbon neutral transport, we must adapt to shared systems. There is only so much room. We actually have enough infrastructure space. We have enough road space, but we utilize that space very inefficiently and very inequitably across our different cities, rural and regional and urban. And what the Wakanda vision looks like is that there are multiple shared systems. So there's the people first, whether you walk, skip, scoot, or skate. And then there is the shared system that you shared mobility, whether or not you're sharing it through a bus or you're sharing it, if you can see the top part of the screen, through a pod or hyperloop or a fast rail or whatever that might be. It's through maximizing this shared system, which links to the next thing. How do we embed electric and autonomous vehicles into our system? And electric and autonomous vehicles will only work with a shared system. EV systems, you can replace an EV car with a normal car and you will not improve the sustainability of the system. It only works if we replace the EV car with a shared EV car as part of that system. And that leads to the AV, the autonomous vehicle portion of that system. Is if we're going to look at the future of transport, then autonomous vehicles, they can't share the same space that our pedestrians and our street space utilize. They must operate different spaces, which leads into spatial segregation, which you can see in this screen, is that we do not have currently, everyone occupies the same space, which means that pedestrians tend to be the lowest priority, vehicles the number one priority. But actually, we have a lot of these above and underground systems. And what the previous two speakers said about sort of biodiversity and respecting the place is that actually we don't have to operate the same planes. We can have a green infrastructure system, a blue infrastructure system, and a transport infrastructure system. And how we build out the future will be really important to evaluating these different spatial systems and different spatial learnings, that what should be at their street space, what should be above, what should be below, and how do we integrate these things together. Now, the last bit, I guess, about this sort of vision is how do we look at our policy and governance and linking this back into circular economy, linking this back into legislation, linking this back into governance. And this is where I think most of my research and a lot of my work has been was what does that actually mean? Because for a long time, we have done one thing that has not really been about building up the needs of everyone or actually thinking about. I know that we said that earlier, someone, and I didn't write who said that, you know, we have these old ways of doing things. But actually, I think that some of the old ways of doing things have been quite good because they've been around community and building the systems. And transport for a long time has actually been the thing that has propelled human movement across the globe to the moon, to Mars, to beyond, where it is a really energy intensive infrastructure and human investment. And I guess we've never thought about the purpose of transport and the future of transport, like the Wakanda vision, is about what is the optimal way to move individuals across society. How do you pull this thread so that this one moves, that enables this health and equality function that we have? And if you look at that, well, what does that look at the whole city? Well, it actually means that your cities function better. And most people on the movement is towards the conglomeration around cities. So how do you take this into a broader system, whether that's high-speed trains, which is necessary, or air travel, to limit air travel based off of necessity and sufficiency? And I actually think we are moving to somewhere. So happening now because of COVID is actually thinking about these things. COVID has been the unfortunate catalyst that has enabled us to think about the opportunities of the transport infrastructure system differently than we ever had. So it's actually enabling that Wakanda vision, because all of these have been implications of it now that actually people are thinking about how do we move locally? What does that mean to physical distance? What does that mean? And what we're seeing is micromobility is the forefront. Micromobility enables a local sufficiency. It enables a local health. It enables sustainability. It enables zero emissions. It enables us to move in the places we want to move that can then be connected to those macro levels of moving, like those high-speed trains, like some of those other Wakanda features. So I think the future of transport is really sort of 5 things. People first. What is efficient versus sufficient? So everything from shared mobilities, which must be a key, and health and micromobility and these mobility as a shared services, into how do we reconcile electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, or even hydro vehicles? How do we ensure spatial segregation of our cities that enables biodiversity and circular economy? And then ultimately, what are the policy and governance factors needed to make this happen? Because a lot of it has been about the intransience of political forces to engage in what we really need to be sustainable. And for any future transport vision, that must be key to delivering our Wakanda future transport that actually integrates these things and means that when we pull one thread, the other thread actually moves. Thank you. That's me.
Thank you, Megan. That was great. I'm immensely pleased that you featured Wakanda in your presentation. I did a course on the science fiction city last semester with UTS students, trying to get them to use those visions as a means to kind of generate new futures for our own cities. And Wakanda, when I first saw it, actually 2 things. I thought urban designers and architects must have worked on this because it has such a richness beyond the normal movie set thing. And the second thing I wondered was, did Mitchell Joachim work on it? Because it reminded me so much of the kind of vision making that Mitchell has within his work. So this is, again, a perfect segue to our next and final speaker, Mitchell Joachim, who is co-founder of Terraform One. He's a professor of practice at NYU. He's got a very august architectural pedigree, working for people like Frank Gehry and I.M. Pei, and won Fulbrights and fellowships with TED and Moshe Safdie. And his work consistently has been one that does these two things that science fiction does: fuses the extreme understandings of technology and its potentials with the kind of idea of what the human imagination can use that technology for. I won't read through all his honors and awards because that would take a very long time. I'm more interested in hearing from him, but please go to his LinkedIn to check those out. I will specifically recommend a couple of books that he's authored. One, Building with Biology, which is called Supercells, and the second, Global Design, Elsewhere Envisioned. And they are both masterful works of this kind of imagining the future in which science fiction, these two things, the use of technology and the imaginative storytelling, come together very beautifully. If we're talking better futures, I can think of no one better to paint us this picture of what those futures could be. Mitchell.
Thanks, Tom. Super glad to be here. I am zooming in from New York City, so it's rather late here. It's getting close to 2 in the morning. So I'm a little bit, I don't know what I could say, zoomed myself, or slightly tired, but excited nonetheless to talk about the future. So I'm going to show some of the work that we've been doing at Terraform One over the years. And a lot of it has to do with problems like this: is Hurricane Sandy, large scale issues in climate dynamics, and how we could think about our cities actually at all scales simultaneously, at many different levels of, working in many different discipline types, so that we can make sure things like this don't happen again. And we have a relationship with the Earth's metabolism that makes sense not only for us, but for every other organism. So this is one of these scariest statistics that we're operating for, or I should say, working to solve. And this is that wildlife population is 50% less since the 1970s. That's every bird, fish, mammal, insect, coral on this planet is disappearing at the rate of one species gone every 7 minutes. We are responsible for that. Certainly all humans on some level, but definitely folks in the development sector, architecture, the built environment, planning, urban design, landscape. This is something that we really need to solve and do everything we can to mitigate these issues. Oops, sorry, I went too fast. So our single overriding predicate is to simply design against extinction. That means we got to do what we need to do to stop things like this. So we'll work on ideas of the city that look at these holistic visions of socio-ecological design. In this case, this is 42nd Street, where we've transformed it in the most super green, I'd say regenerative version of this street that we could possibly imagine. We don't actually think it needs to be this, but it's a kind of a polemic or kind of a point of argumentation that others can then interject their ideas, their solutions, their sorts of technologies and innovations that would make sure that our cities adapt to what's happening already, and then are responsible for what's happening with climate change, and that we can make sure that this doesn't continue. So we have things like a riparian corridor through the center of our streets that accepts all kinds of aqueous life. We have a trackless train here, so we replace shiny metal boxes like cars with high throughput transportation that's completely automated. We've got all types of green walls, not only for air quality, but for food production. We've got photovoltaics, we've got vertical axis wind turbines, and that these streets are actually, and like we've heard before, all about walkability. Privilege the pedestrian. We create these grand civic spaces, and that there is some idea, some modicum of automation that helps maintain these things, but also humans could do that as well. So we'll do other projects like this, which is called the Anti-Extinction Library. This is essentially a kind of an egg or a biotope contained inside an egg. It's got fertilized soil and cryogenically preserved embryos of red-listed creatures or near endangered creatures that would help jumpstart the population. Actually, the egg slowly melts over 7.5 years, which is what the United Nations is now giving us time-wise as far as what we need to do to solve climate change before temperature permanently rises. So, and also that's parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. So these eggs will slowly melt and allow some precious creature in this local environment to help repopulate or rewild that area. And they're also certainly there as a kind of a public sculpture so that people can go, what is this? What is it about? Oh my God, you know, something here is going to disappear. We can do something about it. Other projects we're looking on certainly change scale. This is about population growth to the tune of 11 billion humans by the end of the century. So we've taken a form of analog computation, and we've used E. coli to map populations to the world's densest cities and show growth of humans over time using the E. coli. There's bioluminescent E. coli. We got really good at kind of crafting or working with it to make streets or regions, put them in these alluvium plates. We use the dilution method to count the amount of colonies of E. coli to match human populations in cities and then show it expanding to the scales that we're expecting at around 11 billion humans on Earth. We use these microscopes that are 400 times magnification that project what's happening with the E. coli over the course of this exhibition. And we really reveal the kind of the world growing over time. We're expecting another billion humans in just Asia alone. On the front side of this map is a parametric kind of informatic that shows these spikes where we can expect population happening at those densest points in the world. And then those dark areas are actually shrinking zones, areas that or cities that are not as viable, and we can expect to lose population in those areas. So we used a Buckminster-Fuller map of the world, kind of display this massive increase in population. Another project we're looking at is in food. So this was one of our clients. It's a cricket. The idea here is to eat them. We don't do that in Europe and the United States, but 80% of the population do eat bugs. We eat a lot of cows, pigs, chicken, and lamb, and that's simply not sustainable. We're looking at insect powder as an alternate form of protein. Why? Because it's 2,000 gallons less water to eat protein generated from cricket flour versus cows. It's also 300 times less carbon emissions when you eat flour from insect-based protein versus something like cows or pigs. So this is the cricket shelter and farm. This is an architectural design for a super sanitary, completely hygienic system to grow crickets inside cities for protein production. So this is actually, we don't kill the crickets. They die naturally after 6 weeks. They live throughout the shelter. They repopulate all the different services. And after they die naturally, they are harvested on these little sacks in the center by humans that then mill them into flour. They are fed lime rinds, orange peels, and apple cores, so their gut metabolism tastes really great. We work on these little areas here, which are called cricket sex pods, which is an area where the female crickets meet the males. The males do something called stratolation. They move their wings back and forth and make that chirping sound because they're not concerned about survival. They're actually happy where they are, and they repopulate the entire shelter longitudinally as they meet in these sex pods. Another kind of food architecture project we're working on is something called the plug-in ecology, the urban farm pod. It is not a green wall, it's a green ball. So you get 3 times the amount of surface area. It can be almost any size from 4 feet to 14 feet. You want to grow high yield crops that you want to have locally. So not stuff like wheat or corn, which a good farm in Iowa can do, but things like arugula, spirulina, wheatgrass. You grow on the outside of the system so you can have it fresh and local, go from pasture to plate directly, and grow it inside your farm pod. You can also grow food on the inside, doubling your surface area. We've got 9 columns of sub-irrigation that trickle down to these double skin pots that have a wick irrigation inside them that help grow the food. Also use cellular agronomy. Those are those test tubes there. So we grow food from cells, not from seeds or saplings. And these are intended for urban areas. The entire thing is made of a rotegrity sphere. It comes flat packed and is folded up into that shape. Other projects we're looking at is redesigning furniture. So here's the entire history of chair design in one slide, from 19th century bespoke, custom crafted chairs, where there's a relationship between the maker and the chair itself, to the 20th century, which is essentially plastics and steel and mass consumption and modularity. Thank you, Charles and Reims and Gropius and the Bauhaus. To the 21st century, where we grow chairs. So this is a combination of mycelium, which is the root base of mushroom that we grow into a specified geometry, and it's coated with acetobacter, or bacteria express cellulose. So we're growing these chairs into shapes that you can eat. This is my daughter sitting on one of those chairs in her kindergarten. There's a chair that's made from a series of molds that actually you can eat, just like the crayons or glue in your class. We have adult versions that are made out of 𝗕𝗲𝘁𝗶 with a mycelium surface on the top. It takes 7 days to grow these chairs. And when you're finished with them, if that is the case, they last easily 10 years. You throw them into a garden and they feed thousands of other forms of life, unlike IKEA furniture, which ends up in a landfill. Other projects we're looking at are at the scale of housing. So here we're growing homes using a technology that's 2,500 years old, pleaching, or grafting inosculate matter to form one contiguous vascular system. We have homes where there's no distinction between the landscape and the dwelling. They attach to old growth trees, and then we essentially control the growth of the shell systems themselves. These are these bioreactors that do that. They're wet, dark chambers that tease tap roots of plants to grow super long, essentially wet noodles that get pulled out and put into scaffolds like this. Here we're doing clusters of willows that are grafted together. They're fit into these computer-driven scaffolds and shaped into a specified geometry. So here's a home that actually appears like this on day one, made of willow clusters. The entire surface is grown. It's attached to old growth trees that are already existing on the site. And you have a home that's essentially made out of entirely living materials. This particular home is in upstate New York near Storm King on an old horse farm. The center is made out of 𝗕𝗲𝘁𝗶. So that's the core of the building where the bathroom and the kitchen is. Then pinwheeling off of that are all these living structural shells. And then the last two projects here, we're looking at things like waste in cities. This is styrofoam. It's very difficult to get rid of. Guess what? Mealworms eat it. Mealworms eat the styrofoam. Takes about 7 days for 7 mealworms to eat a cube of styrofoam. That's roughly about a cup. They naturally eat it by having it pass through their digestive system, turning it into frass. Then they eat the frass, and then eventually you get compostable material that could feed your garden. So here we're doing a project for the city of Camden, which has a big problem with styrofoam waste and dumping in general. Produce these biodigesters. You can donate your styrofoam in the back, like some miniature Aztec temple, and watch the mealworms consume it. Eventually the mealworms turn into beetles, and the beetles are eaten by the local bird population. Then finally, the last project, because I know time is very limited, here we're looking at design for extinction when it comes to the monarch butterfly. It's a beautiful insect that is native to New York City. We want to rewild New York City and give this butterfly a chance at life. It doesn't have a voice. So here, this is a sanctuary built into the skin of a building, built into the skin of a building where we've treating the entire life cycle of the monarchs, from its caterpillar phase or egg-laying phase to its chrysalis to its adult butterfly phase. It's a porous facade, so they can go in and out of the structure at will. And they have an area where they can feel absolutely safe. We produce these things for the American Museum of Natural History, where we're working on their insectarium. These are all different types of butterfly feeders, large-scale prints were made to look at the different programmatic elements that butterflies need, such as perching, mud baths, zones for reproduction and air quality. We fit these things into the skin of a building. So we have a double skin facade with all of these different nectar feeder zones, et cetera, for the butterflies. It's a 50% window to wall ratio. So you look outside of your office space, we don't lose a single square footage of building. And you see this vertical biotope to increase biodiversity in cities that is designed specifically for those butterflies. The concrete that we're using lasts 300 years. It is a fly ash impregnated concrete that has the geometry of the butterfly's needs impregnated in that material. Here you can see it. We installed it at the Smithsonian 𝗕𝗲𝘁𝗶 for their show, the Triennial on Nature. And the monarchs are inside enjoying those spaces and getting a chance to kind of coexist with humans in the built environment. So you can see the kind of the space that's inside there with one of these monarchs. Another view of the monarchs hanging out, one of the coral zones. Anyway, thank you very much. That's just some of the work that we are up to, and I will stop share and bring it back to the whole group for us to have a conversation.
Beautiful. Thanks, Mitchell. That's fantastic, as expected. I was watching a little film the other day about 𝗕𝗂𝘁𝗶𝗶 in Mexico, which is one of the other endpoints of where the monarch butterflies end up in Mexico. And it's this quite extraordinary migration of these creatures who are so small, but as a collective managed to transform that place. They show up every year on the Day of the Dead. And so the Day of the Dead celebration in 𝗕𝗂𝘁𝗶𝗶 has become also a celebration of the monarch butterflies returning. And it's been then conflated. Every butterfly represents one of the ancestors of the people that they're celebrating in Day of the Dead. So there's just a really beautiful story about how everything is interconnected. Now, I want to open it up to a little discussion between all our panelists. So I wonder if all of our guests, you wouldn't mind showing yourselves. And I would also encourage the audience to show yourselves. It just makes it a little, I think, more congenial if we have a lot of faces to talk to instead of just ourselves. That's one of the Zoom things we can do. I want to open this up for everyone and start with this kind of this big picture challenge that we have, which I touched on briefly with Alison, this idea about science and technology as understood by indigenous peoples and practiced by them versus this Western Cartesian idea of science and technology. And that whole thing introduced by Descartes, the separation between human thoughts, human rational thoughts, and the rest of the world, which includes not only animate objects, but inanimate objects as well. We'll get into the governance of it because I think this is inextricably linked to our governance systems and our economic systems. But I just want to talk right now, I'd like you all to weigh in on this. I think it's the fundamental challenge we have, you know, how do we, us working within a system which excludes so much and categorizes so much, what are the ways in which we start to almost paradoxically break that system down from the inside? And I'll let anyone who wants to jump into that first, but I'd like all of you to weigh in on that in whatever way you imagine.
I'll start, Tom, you know, because I think looking at Indigenous peoples and all over the world, Indigenous peoples, you know, practiced observation, trial and error, experimentation. You know, they had a system of science. But the distinction, I think, to Western science, you know, which is only hundreds of years old, really. I mean, it has its roots thousands of years ago, a couple of thousands of years ago. But I think the distinction is its taxonomic classification into separate disciplines. You know, I think that's probably the first issue, because that, I think, has given humans this, it's built this mythology that we have this distinctly separate existence to nature. that humans are separate to nature. And it's sort of interesting, you know, because politically in Australia, we Aboriginal people were not considered human until 1967. You know, we were classified as part of the flora and fauna. And you know, we sort of fought for, you know, hard fought for rights to kind of have, to be counted. But I want to sort of go back to being classified as flora and fauna, actually. You know, so not that I want to revert the rights that we've won, but I think it is just, you know, that is obviously what all of the speakers are talking about, this connection to nature. I think the other thing is about the questions that science is asking. I think Western science asks completely different questions to what Indigenous cultures would have asked, you know, which led to just different experiments and different outcomes and different technologies that resulted from that. So I think it's about questioning the questions. And then the other aspect would be about the decision-making around, okay, so we've learnt this, so we, you know, what are the pivot points, and, you know, how do we what's the decision-making framework from which we go? Because I sort of often wonder why Aboriginal people didn't really, here in Australia, didn't really sort of embrace ceramics in a major way. You know, they sort of, with the architecture particularly as well, they sort of kept that quite ephemeral and quite adaptable. But I think if you'd survived the Ice Age, you'd sort of kind of, you can see why the decisions were made to sort of keep the architecture quite lightweight, quite ephemeral, quite temporary, because you need to be on the move. I mean, Aboriginal people had to abandon 80% of the landmass in order to survive the Ice Age. So adaptation and things like that takes a completely different kind of set of decisions, I think, really. But then the only other point I would like to make is that, you know, we have separated the science from the arts. And I think to really have that sort of, the sort of world that Mitchell is describing, which is so exciting, it has to be fully integrated into our cultural life. You know, the art we make, the daily rituals we have, the songs we're listening to, all of it needs to kind of, I think, reinforce this identity that values nature and our place in it, and our responsibility, you know, our place in the long term as well. So that would be my offerings.
Mitchell, go ahead, Megan.
I was going to say, if I can join into that. So, you know, I agree with what everyone's said, and most of my life has been about trying to bridge this divide between what we want and the practicability of achieving that for a faster transition to the area we want. And I think there's probably two things that stand out to me. One is the concept of co-design and disciplinary and activity that we're starting to engage with as a way to facilitate the quicker movement of actually embedding the culture, the arts with this people first movement for those strings. I think in terms of the second practicality I come up with, that how we actually embed those knowledge and learnings is how to break down a very intransient cost benefit and strategic business. Oh, there's my other little one.
Mom.
Can you go up, please? Thanks. How to bridge the cost benefit, that's my youngest. How to benefit the cost, how to bridge the cost benefit criteria and these strategic business cases that don't actually involve what I really, the simple word of the thread that pulls. And these things often don't involve any of these externalities, which has been the basis of my PhD and previous work, is that actually how do you take those things into a co-design process that recognizes that we are not fixed? And I think in terms of transport, it is really fixed. It doesn't take in terms of the transience of what we experience. And I think COVID has brought to forefront this idea of the micro and macro. And I have to admit, I've read Bruce's song lines. And I think that the biggest thing I could take from that relates to transport is that there is this microcosm of how you engage with your local community that actually can break down those inequalities because you support the community, but then how you would engage across those song lines to the macro and the greater movements of those capabilities, which could be the planes and trains and those broader movements of engagement. And I think the only way that the current governments and current policies and procedures can understand that is through this co-design process where they start to break down those things in terms of land use or transport planning. And I think those are our areas of opportunity to really turn the system inside out, to get the things that we want. And that has to be some of those pressure points where if we could start to topple those dominoes, it can enable some of the things that Alison, Mitchell, and Amanda talked about to a greater extent. And that we might be we can achieve, which would create a better and equal system that actually incorporates those ideals.
I'll jump in next if that's okay. So yeah, I mean, I think the way that we move towards all the ideas and new way of humans existing on this planet is really based in changing our economics and our values. So it's a lot about changing the way that we think, but I think some of the initiatives that I've seen that are the most hopeful are the things like the donut economics model that's emerging in Europe and circular economy thinking. They're structural enough, I think, to really shift. But I also feel that, as people, we don't tend to shift too drastically until we see a crisis in front of us that makes us sort of stop in what we're doing and change. And we've seen that with COVID, right? We've seen that we are able, given the right circumstances, to shift our behavior very, very quickly from the largest companies in the world saying everyone must be in an office to work to saying they're going to be remote for the foreseeable future. That kind of rapid change within the space of 2 or 3 months couldn't have been imagined. So I think, sadly, it might take even more destruction than we've already seen, even more situations like, massive bushfires, for us to really shift some of these structural containments that I think are restricting us from actually living in the way that many of us would like to live. So yeah, I see really shifting the economic structure that we hold dear and true needing to happen for us to really radically move in this direction. And I think meanwhile, those of us that are working in this space, for me, it's very much about trying to shift people to re-engage and reawaken this connection to nature, one person at a time.
Mitchell?
Yeah, sure. I'll add to that. I certainly agree with Alison, Megan, and Amanda. Actually, I really like seeing Megan's kid come in during the lecture. I've got 2 daughters, and they get to see daddy at work all the time now, which is great. And that the things that I believe in and discuss, they're certainly a part of it. Actually, for the Q&A, they're always like, well, at least my younger one, who's 7, will raise her hand because she thinks she's got a question for me, which is great. But so we do this for the kids, right? It's all about intergenerational design. I think also on Amanda's point about crises, I couldn't agree more. I think that, doing this for 20 something years, talking about ideas about climate dynamics and designs and architectures to sort of mitigate that or stop it. But frankly, it's going to be something like a massive crisis similar to COVID-19 that's going to be the impetus behind that change. Paul Gilding and others, a lot of folks in the dark ecology movement, et cetera, really think that all the science, all the planning, libraries filled with solutions for civilization 2.0 really is not going to happen until people feel this kind of sense of urgency. If their lizard brains are activated and there is a disaster that they're confronting together and universally. We like to, in the United States, we talk about it as our kind of our Pearl Harbor moment. Because Pearl Harbor represented a time when the US was in constant conflict, being isolationists. I guess we're doing that again. Not all of us, some, but didn't want to enter the World War. And when we were attacked in Pearl Harbor, all of that kind of dialogue ceased to exist, and we immediately shook hands across the aisle and agreed to transform our infrastructure, to transform our economy, to be very much a part of the war effort. And almost overnight, within 2 or 3 days, we had that agreement. And within less than a few months, we were here fighting a common enemy. So the entire contiguous United States was working towards defense and stopping what Hitler was doing. And I think that's what's going to happen when it comes to our issues with climate change. A massive crisis, something that we haven't seen bigger than Hurricane Sandy or Katrina, or various oil spills in the Gulf, or even back with the Valdez spill. That's not enough. It's probably going to be something fearsome and ugly, but at that moment, that's what's going to create the change. And unfortunately, I really think we need to do that before the crisis hits us. But I think that's what's going to take to get the political will and the capricious public behind it to maneuver all the things that need to happen to shift our infrastructure into this this next kind of order of civilization that makes sense with our planet. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. We're going to just have a little wrap up, and I would say we had our what you would call apocalyptic crisis in Australia last year, and I'm sure those of you who weren't here saw the absolute severity of it. We still haven't even come to terms with the impact of it in terms of ecosystemic loss, in terms of animals lost, in terms of the permanent damage wrought. This seems really, you would have thought that that was a transitional moment, but it wasn't. A lot of the slogans afterwards were "Build Back Better," without a question of saying, should we build at all? Should we retreat? Should we change our ways? But I would say this case, if we have, to your point, Amanda, of the systems that we built, if we built them, we can unbuild them. And maybe not necessarily rebuild them, but think about the different ways of being. So I just want you all to have a 1-minute closing remark, and we'll try and touch on a couple of the questions from some of the panelists, one of which is about the role of government, and another one is about how do we scale this, not just globally, but in terms of the speed and rapidity we need. So what is, if any, the role of government, or what other roles of governance, because we are talking about all of this leading to COP26 and recommendations, what's the role of governance, and what new kinds of governance do we need to have to drive this forward? And I'll give each of you 60 seconds to weigh in on that ambitious question.
Excuse me, just went to speak and then I had a frog in my throat. Yeah, so I think notoriously when you look at who's led, it's not been governments. Governments are actually slow to lead and slow to change, and especially in the way that many of them are elected. They're looking to, respond to their constituents, and they're conservative in how they make rapid change. At the same time, I see some leadership, coming in, for example, in New Zealand saying we're going to be a zero carbon country, and others saying, something similar. So, maybe government can transition from this place where they've notoriously been slow to lead to a place of leading, because, there will be unfolding series of crises. So, you know, I agree. I think there was a comment or a question in the chat that, you know, the bushfires here weren't enough. So, you know, it's going to take a series of more for that to happen. And, you know, I think governments will be forced to lead by their people, but essentially, you know, industry, I believe, needs to lead. And we've got to see a transition of, you know, of governments sort of acting in a very different way to how they have been currently.
Thanks, Amanda. Megan, can I put you in the hot spot?
Yeah, that's fine. I think there's a few things. One is to answer when do we change? We refer to that a lot in academia as path dependency. You have to hit a threshold of uncomfortableness. As you become comfortable, it is more difficult to become uncomfortable with the situation around you. And that this threshold of uncomfortableness, whether it's bushfires or racial inequality or transport inequality, that if a large number of people feel comfortable, it will be very difficult to change for those who feel uncomfortable. That's one issue. The second is the idea of global resource usage in terms of our macro markets and how we distribute whatever the footprint or the biophilia or the transport, and those global resource usage are already connected. We can't unconnect them, but actually they present a very big lever for change because it makes those people who are comfortable uncomfortable, and we must apply those pressure points. And then the third aspect, I think, in terms of governance and changes is that as humans, we love to be outdoors. We love to walk. That doesn't really change no matter where you pick data or what you engage with. And that is a significant area of opportunity for us as community or activists on the ground that we haven't engaged with fully, but actually focusing on your super local and engaging in that community aspect in your, wherever you can walk within 10 minutes is the perfect place to start to then make other people uncomfortable for those broader changes that we'd like.
Mitchell or Alison, can I get you to weigh in? Thanks, Alison.
I'll go first, if you don't mind, Mitchell. You know, I've been asked to be a politician a lot, actually, on both sides of government in this country. You'd laugh which parties ask me to join them. But, you know, the thing, I'm an artist. And, you know, I feel like art is, you know, an act of power, you know, and I look at Mitchell's work and I think that is imagination. And no leader on this planet has any imagination. You know, if only the rich had imagination, you know, we might be in a better position. But I think it's kind of up to all of the creatives and the designers and the artists to create a revolution. I just don't think it's going to be an elected situation. I think we need to create a revolution that kind of, I really agree with what Megan was saying about agitation. Like the electric blanket has been turned off now, right? So if you bring agitation together at the same time with imagination, so that all of the films we're making, you know, like if I see another dystopian future, I'm going to scream. I want to see, when was the last utopian society you saw on film? It just drives me insane. I would like to see, you know, people don't know what they don't know. I think if anyone saw some of these visions of the cities that Terraform is designing, then I think we would all be inspired and motivated and vitalized to create a revolution.
Yeah, I'm definitely for a revolution, and I agree with all of my fellow panelists. Maybe for 60 seconds, as quickly as I can, something about government. I think I use this metaphor that we're all on a plane, and we've got people, government, and specialists. And I think the people need to decide where the plane is going. That's it. That's democracy. And the government is the best way that we can help facilitate that. I think they help organize the people to finally make a decision on where that plane is going. Either we're going to a place that's really bad, that doesn't make sense for our planet, or we go to a place that actually restores the climate, regenerates, I guess, life as we know it, and gives ourselves a future. But the people that actually fly the plane after that decision is made are the specialists. Those are anyone from the scientists, the engineers, the artists, all the different thinkers that have devoted their lives to this need to coordinate together in that cockpit to make the right set of choices based on what the government and the public has said and fly that plane in that direction. So that's my sort of 60-second, as cogent as possible description of what I think the government can do.
Thanks, Mitchell, and thank you all. Now, we're just going to wrap up. I will remind all of you to check the link in the chat because it exhorts you to send in your own visionary ideas to contribute to the futures we're all going to have. And I think it's important in wrapping up that we need to move beyond resilience. To me, resilience is simply maintaining what we have. And we know so much of that isn't working and will not be able to work. I think we need to have a couple other R words, and I borrow these from Jem Bendell in his great piece on deep adaptation. Beyond resilience, we need to accept relinquishment. We need to give things up. So the question to ask is, what are we prepared to lose? People don't like to lose, right? So this needs to be matched with another thing, a restoration. What will we get back? What will we restore? What will we regain in our lives, whether it's direct contact with each other, whether it's direct engagement with nature, whether it is a direct role in the working of the world, rather than feeling we're disconnected from everything. This is the work that we need to do. These are the questions we need to ask. It's easy to be a pessimist. It's also easy to be an optimist and say, don't worry, they'll all figure it out. But I read a lot of Rebecca Solnit, the great writer and thinker, and she says, look, those are both defeatist positions. You know, the pessimist thinks everything's going to be shit, so they don't need to do anything. The optimist thinks everything's going to be fine, so they don't bother to do anything. She said much more constructive is to have hope. This demands that you construct a better future, but it also demands that you take agency in making that better future. So with everything that we know, this is the question which I'd like to leave all of you with everything that we know, all of these changes, all of these crises, ask yourself, what is the work it makes sense to be doing? I think we've had enormously inspirational examples from all our panelists, who I really want to thank, Alison, Amanda, Megan, and Mitchell. This to me is hope. Right? This is the way forward, right? We're not optimists, we're not pessimists. We go, holy shit, that's really good stuff. How do we get there? So I want to thank all of you, and again, ask all of you joining in to send us a postcard with your own vision of hope and how we might get there. And thanks to Lisa and all the team for the organization of all of this. And thanks again, guys, and Mitchell especially for staying up so late. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you for the next one in a couple of days. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.